So a brief background on state rule or laws about medical marijuana. In 2008, following a ballot initiative, voters passing allowing medical marijuana to be consumed and grown in the state, it allows for patients and caregivers. And so that patient-caregiver model has been around for a little while, about 10 years. But that did not allow for the commercial production, processing, sale, et cetera, of medical marijuana. So in 2016, the state passed the Medical Marijuana Facilities Licensing Act, and that does allow for the commercial uses associated with medical marijuana. There are 5 license types. I'll be going through those in more specifically in a moment. Communities have to opt in. So the legislation gives the community a choice to opt in or not do anything, and that's considering opting out. So if a community opts in, they have a lot of latitude on how they're going to regulate medical marijuana uses locally. But they have to take that action to opt in. To date, I believe it's around 110 communities across the state out of 1,700 some. So there's less than 10% of communities across the state have opted in. Very few in West Michigan. Grand Rapids opted in July. So there are 2 steps to state licensing outside of local approval. State licensing has a phase 1, which is pre-qualification. Basically a pretty significant background check that's all about the entity, all about the applicant. And as our ordinance is right now, once the applicant receives phase 1 approval or pre-qualification, they could then apply to local ordinance or for local ordinance approval. After that, if they get local approval from the city, they go back to the state and get phase 2, which would be licensing. So as it is right now, first pre-qualification, then local approval, then licensing. And local approval would include permitting, construction, inspections. And then once all that's done, at that point, you go back to the state and hope to give you the license. Right? And then both of those licensing steps are administered by the state LARA, Licensing and Regulatory Agency, their Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation, which was created specifically for these laws, known colloquially as BUMMER. So as of 2008, after the Medical Marijuana or Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, Grand Rapids, we changed our zoning ordinance to allow caregivers basically growing of marijuana plants in the house as a home occupation if they're a licensed caregiver by the state. And we have, as far as I know, 1 licensed caregiver on the northeast side. Recently, a recent court case, I don't think I mentioned that in here, a recent court case, I believe it was even this year in Byron Township, basically negated that. So we can't really control with local zoning MMA. So that's been taken out as of our new ordinance. We're just going to be administering the commercial medical marijuana uses and not medical marijuana as patients and caregivers. As of 2016, when the MMFLA was passed, the city commission chose not to opt in, said nope, not interested at this point. But there was a ballot initiative that was proposed earlier this year that would have changed everything and essentially said yes, all these uses, all these license types will be approved essentially anywhere. And we learned about that, and the city commission said, okay, maybe we should act now, and at least have some sort of reasonable land use control over these license types. Zoning isn't changed by a ballot initiative, so I think that was sort of why the zoning approach was taken. If we do a zoning only approach, it's sort of a little bit safe from a ballot. But that was sort of the impetus for the city commission to take action in this year. So that was in April. We started working on it, or maybe March, and did a little breakneck research and passed an ordinance in July after quite a bit of community engagement and a couple of public hearings. So that's where we are now. As far as our ordinance, I mentioned we approved it or the city commission adopted it in July. July 24th. They had originally set an effective date of November 1st. That is now uncertain as of last Last month, I think it was September 18th, the City Commission set a moratorium on the ordinance for 6 months or until they have a new effective date. So it could be up to March 18th of 2019, but we expect that we'll have sort of a more firm timeline actually coming out of the work session that I mentioned is later today. So November 1st is no longer on the table. Just want to make that clear. The ordinance does allow all of the medical marijuana license types as enabled by the state. All of them are going to be special land uses in the city, regardless of location. We allow them in commercial and industrial zones with separation distances. The separation distance is an interesting measurement and allows some waivers. I'll get into that in more detail in a moment too. And then we have several application requirements. I mentioned they're all going to be special land uses, so many of you have been through the special land use process with your clients, and you know how that goes, where you have the application and sometimes neighborhood meeting, which is required as part of this ordinance, the planning commission meeting with a public hearing, process that way. The supplemental documentation is, we have a fair amount required. We have a 5-page checklist of the boxes to check off with all the different documents. And I'm realizing I have a handout here that I didn't pass out. And then the state enables us to ask or require a fee of up to $5,000 to help cover our costs, and the city will be assessing that fee of $5,000 in order to cover costs. There should be more than enough if you want to take multiples. So the license types, I mentioned there are 5 that are allowed by the MMFLA. We allow all 5. Provisioning center is the retail sales of medical marijuana products. Safety compliance is testing. They're testing from the grow facility or testing from the processor, making sure that the state has a exhaustive list of pesticides, heavy metals, different kind of problems that could hit these plants. Butane, for example, one of the processing methods uses butane or other volatile chemicals. And so a testing facility would essentially make sure that those chemicals are not on the plants when they go to market. And those have to be completely independent, by the way, from any of the other license types. Processor is takes the plants from the growers and processes them into some other product. So they might be extracting chemicals and putting the chemicals into some sort of product, crackers or chocolate bar or shatter or some product that can be used and sold at a provisioning center. Or they can just, basically they're just changing it into some other form from just plant. The grower grows the marijuana plants and can either send them to provisioning centers for sale or can send them to a processor for that. And then a secure transporter is a license type that basically the grower, processor, and provisioning center, in order to transport the marijuana between those 3 license types, they have to use a secure transporter, which is essentially like a armored car. The safety compliance facility has to go out and pick up samples from the grower or samples from the processor and does not have to use a secure transport. But essentially, you have your armored car, these 3 license types that have to use that armored car to move their product around in whatever form it's in, and then the testing lab. So we allow all 5 types of those, all as special land uses. In most commercial zones, we allow provisioning centers, processors, safety compliance facilities, again as special land use. Processor, the restriction is that it must be less than 15,000 square feet. Now that's a 15,000 square foot processor is enormous, huge. You can have one that's 1,000 square feet and it's fine. So either way, we have this provision to allow those in most commercial zone districts. Growers and secure transport are currently not allowed in commercial zone districts. When I say most commercial zone districts, I don't believe we're allowed, not in the city center zone district. They're not allowed there. Otherwise, generally in commercial zone districts as a special land use, those 3 license types are allowed. In industrial zone, all of them are allowed, again, in special land uses. The caveat being for provisioning center, the provisioning center as a retail use can only be accessory to a grower or a processor. That's very similar to how we have it right now in industrial zone districts. If you have an industrial use where you're making shoes, for example, you can have a small retail storefront or retail component. It can't be any larger than 25% of the overall industrial use. So same thing goes with provisioning center, just sort of going but with the same way that the industrial uses allow some sort of accessory retail or office use right now. It has to be accessory. Okay. We have separation distance requirements. So for most, there are several what are considered sensitive land uses that require a separation distance. Most of them require a 1,000-foot separation distance, and that's from property line to property line. Parks, playgrounds, public parks and playgrounds are one. Religious institutions, and licensed substance use disorder programs by the state. Those need a 1,000-foot separation requirement. Child care centers, again, licensed child care centers from the state. Public or private K-12 schools, and other marijuana uses, when established, have a 1,000-foot separation. Now the wrinkle there is that, except for provisioning centers, from one provisioning center to another, you have to have a 2,000-foot separation distance, which creates some problems when you have co-located. Okay, I should have mentioned, the state allows the provisioning center, processor, and grower to be co-located under certain circumstances. So you can have sort of a vertically integrated model. You have your grower, you move it within the building to the processor, you process it, you move it to the retail, and then you sell it out the storefront. So that would only happen in industrial use because the grower is not allowed in commercial districts. So when you have other marijuana uses of 1,000 feet normally, that grower to anything else, a grower to a provisioning center only needs to be 1,000 feet, but if that grower has a provisioning center co-located with it, you're gonna have an issue. So these separation distances are kind of interesting. The waiver also changes the equation because those three uses, the parks, playgrounds, religious institutions, and substance use disorder programs, can all be waived. They can waive their own separation distance requirements. Now the parks and playgrounds are public facilities, so they have to be waived by the city commission. We're gonna be asking them about that today. Hey guys, what do you want the process to be? Religious institutions and substance use disorder programs are private entities, and so they can offer a waiver. The issue is that for all of these waivers, the planning commission still has to approve it. Has to find that, yeah, it's not going to be a detrimental. So what we've seen is especially with religious institutions, they're offering waivers, and sometimes in return for something, and so it's kind of been a interesting sort of game to watch, and without really any guidelines. So we're going to be talking to the city commission about that today as well. Now, there's a final separation distance requirement that's from residential zone districts. The issue with that is that it's measured differently. It's not from a radius, it's a linear measurement along the primary street frontage. So what happened is that if we had a radius separation distance like for the other uses, especially in your neighborhood business districts, almost any separation distance would take those neighborhood business districts out, because most of our neighborhood business districts are right in front, like just to the behind them isn't maybe an alley and then residential zones. So that would have cut out all the neighborhood business districts, and some city commissioners determined that they wanted this to be allowable in neighborhood business districts under certain circumstances. So they said, let's have 1,000 foot, but up and down the primary street. So it doesn't turn corners, but it follows a curve, right? Because along the same street. So that's been an interesting mapping exercise. So those are how the separation distances control how many facilities we can have. Many communities in Michigan will say, okay, we're going to set a cap on the number of facilities at whatever number, 1, 3, 80. You know, some number of whatever license type. Grand Rapids has no cap for any of the license types, but we do have these separation distances and zoning controls. So once you sort of add in all the different separation distances of the right zones, we limit our numbers quite a bit. You know, we have 67,000 parcels in the city, and when it comes down to it, we have a maximum based on all these separations of under 100 facilities, total 100 parcels. Oh, excuse me. Several hundred parcels, but once you add the separation distance in, it changes the game, right? Especially when one facility gets established, then it has a separation distance. if you had sort of optimal spacing so you could fit as many in as possible in those locations, we'd end up with less than 100 facilities across all license types. So the waivers, we've been asking for a description of how did you find, like as a petitioner, how did you find that sensitive land use? How did you notify them that you're intending to request a special land use, that you're intending to request a waiver from them? And then a statement by the property owner, and most likely also the owner of the sensitive land use if they're different. Express written consent, a description of why they feel that it won't have that given the waiver would have a detrimental impact, and that's what this planning commission has to look at. And then a written description of any consideration given. So that's what we have at least right now for the waivers. And for the public waivers, like parks and playgrounds, we're just going to have to go to the city commission as it is right now, get a resolution for each request. So that's going to slow down the process potentially. So I want to talk about the city website that we have and our mapping system that we've set up. Pull this up real quick. Okay, so we have a page specifically for medical marijuana. Actually, I'm just going to go to the city home site. Okay, city homepage. All the way down at the bottom of the city homepage, grandrapidmi.gov is a medical marijuana link. Click on that, or you can just type in medical marijuana at the top. You can search for weed. You can search for whatever you want, and I'll get you there. So we've made this our primary communication method. I also have a list. If you have clients or you are a practitioner or you're going to be working with practitioners, send me an email and I'll put you on my list. It's hundreds of people right now. And I send out updates periodically. I also have the infographic that I just handed out, a list of potential suitable sites, GIS shapefiles people can use for mapping, the map, videos of the different city commission meetings, neighborhood associations, the emails I've sent out. But I want to draw your attention to one thing in particular. This interactive mapping system, people have found to be fairly helpful. Now it's going to be disclaimed heavily, saying this is just our best guess. You have to click that box. So on this map, if you zoom in, you'll see two colors, the red and orange. And at certain levels, you zoom in and you'll see the sensitive land uses come in. Even further in, they'll start putting their mask on so that you'll see the 1,000-foot buffer. So, and all the yellow color is all residential zone districts. So this is basically how we found where are these potentially suitable sites. The red and the orange are just saying these are properties that we're pretty sure are going to be suitable or potentially suitable. We can't guarantee any of it, and we're essentially making the applicant. Now some cities have said, yep, that parcel's good, but we can't do that. What we can do is say, we're pretty sure. And the red parcels are that we're pretty sure that this is going to be suitable as is. Special land use, that's it. The orange parcels require at least one waiver. So, right, well, and that's the reason why we can't guarantee anything, is because so Kristen said, it's based on land use that we were aware of at the time, right? It's a point in time that we found the licenses from the state of the certain land uses. We're aware that certain religious institutions are there. We're aware that schools are active. If land uses come and go, we can't necessarily track all of them. So that's why we disclaim this stuff. As of the date, as of 8/8, and this is current as far as we know, like September. And we'll periodically try to check it. So we're reasonably sure that these are correct, but that's why we can't guarantee them, because it's all based on one point in time. So if you were to click on a parcel, oh great, 1340 Monroe is probably suitable. Wonderful. Of course, more disclaiming here, but that's just us covering ourselves. But then if you click on an orange parcel, you'll see that, oh, this one's probably suitable, but only with waivers. And then if you click this little arrow, it might tell you which waivers you're going to need. So he's saying, okay, here's a diocese, that's what St. Alice. You're going to have to talk to them about granting a waiver. Here's Crescent Christian Reformed Church at 238 Spencer. Oh, there's another one, New City Church. And another one's just showing up for Crescent Christian. Okay. So you have several church waivers that you need to get in order to make that property go for any license type. You can see here the residential zones are right behind some of these addresses in Creston along Plainfield. And again, that's because the residential zone buffer would apply along the main street, in this case Plainfield, and not down the side streets like Grove. So I hope it's a useful tool. We do try to update it periodically. I would suggest looking through it. As far as community engagement, we do have points of engagement built in to the process. We require a good neighbor plan. Is that a good neighborhood plan? Good neighbor plan doesn't matter. A good neighbor plan is basically saying, how are we going to be a good neighbor to you? You know, and we're doing this with alcohol sales uses right now. We have it built into the ordinance for medical marijuana as well. How are we going to handle litter or loitering or trespassing or communication with our neighborhood if there's an issue? Basically just how is my business going to work well with your neighborhood, and you have to come up with that working with the neighborhood association. So we have that built in, and basically have to have a pretty good draft of the good neighbor plan ready in order to apply. So there's a pretty significant upfront community engagement component for these uses. Let's see here. Yeah, just another point of engagement is as a special land use, these all have a public hearing at the Planning Commission built in. And then we've had several requests from neighborhood associations saying if there's going to be a waiver for a park, you know, park playground because it's a public entity, it has to go to the city commission. The city commission can optionally require a public hearing for almost anything. So we've had neighborhood requests for a public hearing at the city commission level for those park waivers. We did go to the Parks and Rec Advisory Board and said, hey, do you guys want to review this? And said, no, we would rather defer to the city commission on this. Whether the city commission agrees with them, we'll find out. But at least that might happen, where you might have a public hearing requirement at the city commission level as well for park waiver. Okay, so good neighbor plan is required. We have what's considered it's voluntary. The VEDA is Voluntary Equitable Development Agreement. And this is a policy that the city commission came up with for development projects, often related to incentives they're getting for economic development or economic development incentives. It's voluntary, so we can't require it because it's talking about equitable development goals, which are typically about people. And as you guys know, as development professionals, the zoning ordinance, because this is all in the zoning ordinance deals with land use and not, you know, the applicant doesn't matter, the land use matters. So who the applicant is hiring can't matter for a zoning ordinance. You know, what kind of housing, what kind of building they're putting on, what kind of local contracting are they doing? Were they doing as far as job training for, you know, increasing local capacity? These are great goals. They just don't really belong in a zoning ordinance. So the city commission has said, great, this potentially has a great neighborhood impact. We think that we should require a VEDA. We said you can't require something that's voluntary. You can incentivize it. So we're working through different ways of incentivizing a VEDA. The VEDA, and we're getting a lot of guidance, this is going to be a major topic of conversation today at today's work session at 1:30. Will most likely be some sort of a contract between practitioners and city commission only, where it won't be with the neighborhood. They're already working with the neighborhoods on the good neighbor plan. And each one will have to be approved by the city commission. So what we're hoping to propose, at least what we're going to propose and hope they agree with, is that maybe they can pre-approve a standard form VEDA so that there's some predictability to these things. The question is, how do we incentivize them? And we've been working through different ways of doing that, most likely through the application process, which brings into that the process and timeline. The reason I showed this camp out model is because we've seen it happen in other cities. We'd originally proposed a first come first served model for applications. Then we talked to folks like Ann Arbor who had 3 weeks of, not 3 weeks, excuse me, many people in line for several days, I think a week, just waiting in line to get their application in first. Because especially when you have separation distances, timing is very important. Being in first is very important because then you have this defensive move that's happening where 1,000 feet around you, or 2,000 feet in this case for provisioning centers, you can't have anything else locate. So the separation distance requirement, which many places have, sort of changes the equation because it makes timing very important. Douglas, Michigan, Douglas down by Saugatuck, had 3 licenses that they were going to be able to give out, and they had a line for 4 days. So we were expecting, with a first come, first serve, okay, we're probably going to have a camp out going on. And many people in line, and where is this going to make the most sense? We had a big meeting with staff and talked it over, and all different departments, and we said, okay, it's going to actually make sense in Calder Plaza. So we're going to have this big tent city on Calder Plaza, and we're going to have to put a lot of different rules and guidelines and probably tape out spaces, and the moment we tape out space, someone's going to be there. I had somebody tell me that they were going to hire a private eye to follow me, so to make sure that when I went to tape out those spaces, they would get a call, and they'd be the first in that space. I'm like, come on, I don't want that. We also had some concerns about security. The marijuana industry, in some cases, tends to be sold cash-based because of federal regulations. And so, and if we have a $5,000 application fee, we don't want people having that in cash. So we were going to separate the fee requirement from the application date. So we'd say, okay, you can apply only after we accept your application. Can you pay for it? And then it's sort of a second step to your process. But if nothing else, the perception could still be there that all these people camped out are going to have $5,000 in cash at least. Well, if they're applying for multiple licenses, there'll be a ton of cash sitting on Calder Plaza. That's a pretty big target, right? So we were concerned about security for the people in line. And then we had questions about logistics, you know, and are we going to have police presence? Are we going to have bathrooms? You know, we were receiving reports from a couple communities that they were having people that would get in fights to try to get each other's spot in line, or they'd say, here's $100,000 if you switch places. And I'm going, okay, what's worth losing my job over, right? Maybe I should just get in line. But I'm kidding. But the idea is that there are a lot of problems that come up with this. So we said, okay, let's change the process. We don't really have it set because then we came up with a selection process that ended up seeming like a lottery. There was this unfortunately titled MLive article that said, Grand Rapids will pick licenses by lottery. It's like, oh man, I wish you'd called me first. Because the licenses would not be given out by lottery. We wouldn't be assigning any land use rights. The idea was to have a lottery to set order of planning commission approval or condition, or order of planning commission consideration, order only. And that would be at least how we could avoid some of those issues that we were anticipating from the first come first serve model. So right now we sort of had to take the lottery idea off the table because there were concerns about that. Have also been other lotteries that have happened in the state that we're not sure are completely legally defensible. As far as we're aware, picking the planning commission order by lottery is, and possibly maybe the most fair and most legally defensible method. So we're working through that. We're going to talk about it today. I've been telling people for the last 2 months, man, I wish I could tell you for sure, but we know that there are things that are going to change. So hopefully after today we'll have more answers, like really definitive answers. But so what we do know is that you have the special land use application of supplemental, well, I shouldn't say application, but supplemental requirements, a whole bunch of documents, your $5,000 per license, and an effective date, which will most likely at this point be the first couple months of next year. That may not be the same date as the opening date for applications. I would expect, in fact, that the City Commission will set an effective date that will be significantly earlier than the first date for applications. And that's partially because it's very difficult to administer an ordinance that's not effective. So if people want to apply for a variance or have, you know, administrative departures they would need, we don't have anything to depart from or get a variance from until that ordinance is effective. So we'll see how that goes, and hopefully we'll know again today. Just as far as the acceptance, we have we talked to our city treasurer, and they had been really concerned that we couldn't actually take anyone's money for all the banks. We work with like 30 banks in the city, and so the treasurer actually went out and talked to all of them and says, okay, we're actually good. We're going to be able to accept fees. So that's good. We are still working on a zoning fee policy about, like right now, if you submit a special land use application and then have to withdraw it, if we haven't sent the public notice, we can usually at least do a partial refund. If we have, we can't do much. But we, because this application fee is much higher, it's $5,000, and if you apply and then somebody else applies next door or a block away within 1,000 feet, your timing is very important. We want to be able to have some sort of a reasonable refund policy or transfer your application fee to another location. So we're working on that. So the fee question is still outstanding, but coming soon. We typically have 6 or 7 places on each planning commission agenda. We expect that there will be a lot of applications. So we're trying to get about 3 at least reserved for other development projects, like non-marijuana related. I want to mention one thing. There's been discussion. I mentioned the 2 phases of state approval, pre-qualification and licensing. There's been some discussion of removing the pre-qualification requirement. I don't know if that's going to happen. But if it does, we can expect our application volume to go up dramatically. Based on my conversations with many practitioners and their contractors, I expect at least 100 applications if we have the pre-qualification requirement. If we do, at least more than that, most likely, maybe a couple hundred. If we take away that pre-qualification requirement, we're taking away a major step, a major barrier, which on one hand is great from a purely selfish standpoint. From an administrative burden, I'm going, oh great, now we're going to have 1,000 applications. It could be that. So we're going, okay, and how far out are we going to have these on the Planning Commission agenda? So in order to not have, the entire year of 2019 full of marijuana applications, every meeting, we're going to be reserving some places for development projects that are not marijuana. And then as far as acceptance, we do intend to, this is where timing matters. We're going to review, our initial review will be for completeness, making sure you have everything in your application, but we're not going to be reviewing standards. Like, the staff is not making a decision here because the city commission said everything should be special land use. It's all going to the planning commission, so the staff review will be, is your application complete? And in that, when it is, we'll say, great, you're going to be in the, somehow you're going to get on the agenda for the planning commission, however that's assigned. We're going to get there. If it's not complete, though, we're going to return it to you and say, here's where it's not complete. But the problem would be that because timing's so important, it could hurt you significantly if you have an incomplete application. So completeness is going to be very important. So if you're a practitioner or if you guys are working with practitioners, don't lose sight of that. Completeness is super important. Otherwise, it could mean the difference between the business working or not. Okay, so as far as many of you are development professionals, sort of thinking about what can your roles be. You tend to be development or connected with the development community and the development world, and they may not be, right? As all of your clients are. So that's good. You can probably help, especially those of you with surveying in your firm. We've had a lot of practitioners who are hiring surveyors to confirm those separation distances, find the property lines, and make sure. We had one that was 1,000 and I think inches, and 1,000 feet and inches, and they went, great. I mean, like 10 inches, 1,003. It was like super close. So that kind of separation distance can't be done by walking out with a planometer, whatever it is, right? So specific building needs for each license type. A grower is going to be completely different than a processor, completely different from a provisioning center, completely different from a lab, from a transporter, right? They'll have different building needs, different types. I don't know what you guys want to do. As far as if you're an architect or builder, there are architects and builders who specialize in this stuff, but the practitioners may not. They might have some ideas, but they might not have the exact details down, especially if they're entering the industry right now. Due diligence is very important. Again, we're putting a lot of the responsibility on the applicant to do their due diligence, especially because of that completeness issue and the separation distances. And other codes and regulations, A lot of times I've had practitioners come in and say, great, I think I'm going to meet all these requirements. I say, well, there's still 350 pages of zoning ordinance that you have to still worry about, right? Oh my God, what? Like I forgot about that. I'm just worried about the marijuana stuff. Well, yeah, we also need to talk about building height and scale and transparency and all this stuff that you guys deal with all the time, but they don't necessarily. So, or building codes. You know, as development professionals, you guys will know those. The clients might not.